Welcome to the Good Reading Podcast, proudly sponsored by Book People Gift Cards. A Book People gift card is the perfect gift for readers of all ages. Simply order your gift card online at bookpeoplegiftcards.org.au. Redeem at any one of over 500 bookshops across Australia. Visit bookpeoplegiftcards.org.au. Nadia Wheatley is the editor of Sneaky Little Revolutions, selected essays of Charmian Clift, and the author of The Life and Myth of Charmian Clift, which in 2001 was the Age newspaper's non-fiction book of the year, and the New South Wales Premier's Australian History Prize winner in 2002. Today I'm talking to Nadia Wheatley about Charmian Clift's final unfinished novel, The End of the Morning, which Nadia has edited and is now published for the very first time. Nadia, welcome to the Good Reading Podcast.
Good to talk to you.
The life of Charmian Clift is one bound up with that of George Johnston, but can you untangle for us the threads of her own life from the fabric of what you call this author couple?
Yes, Charmian was born in 1923 in the small New South Wales township of North Kiama on the northern side of the coastal town of Kiama, and grew up there until she was about 19. So she had a whole life, as most of us do before we meet our life partner and get married. And it is of that life in that coastal town that her new book, The End of the Morning, is concerned. But fast forwarding a bit, she was a lieutenant in the Australian Army, and in 1946, after leaving the Army, she met an older man, a well-known war correspondent named George Johnston. They were both working for the Melbourne Argus. They fell dramatically in love, caused a scandal in the office, got the sack, and escaped back to Kiama on the New South Wales south coast, proceeded to have a child pretty quickly and also to collaborate on a novel pretty quickly. And subsequently, with two children, went to London in 1951, moved to Greece a few years later, initially to the island of Kalymnos and then to the island of Hydra, and worked on a number of novels and travel books separately and together, and returned to Australia in 1964. When they returned, George had just published his classic Australian novel, My Brother Jack, his story of his childhood, his growing up, his wartime years, which features a fictional version of Charmian. And Charmian began working for the Sydney Morning Herald and for the Melbourne Herald, writing essays. When they returned, they had three children, but George was terribly ill. He'd contracted tuberculosis during the war. He went into hospital and had what he called his shark bite, a great big lump taken out of his lung, and was in there for many months. And he subsequently, a couple of years later, spent another 9 months in hospital. So during those periods, Charmian Clift was the breadwinner. It was her essays that were the regular family income. And of course, she was the single mother of three children when George was in hospital.
Before we get to the story, I want to ask you about the manuscript you were confronted with. What condition was it in, and how long has this project been in the making?
Round about 1980 was when I began work on a biography of Charmian Clift, and I'll say that I had previously been the partner of her elder son, Martin Johnston. We'd amicably separated, and I kind of inherited the project from him without intending to do it. So early on in the research, I went to the National Library and I saw the manuscript, which is a typescript, and the section that's now being published was in very good shape. It was well edited. Subsequently, a slightly different version came into my life, which Charmian had given a friend, and that confirmed that this work was completed to this page limit, which is about 50 pages, to her satisfaction. At that time, and 20 years later, in 2001, when I published The Life and Myth of Charmian Clift, she hadn't been forgotten, but there wasn't enough of a market for her work to warrant republishing an unpublished work. I published a collection of her essays in 2001 at the same time as the biography, and though the biography won 2 major prizes, the whole thing sunk without trace. It just wasn't the right time. So for me to go to a publisher, and of course publishers are in this job to get money, fair enough. For me to go to a publisher and suggest publishing an unpublished novel would have been ridiculous. So I put the two slightly different, written 6 years apart, versions of the typescript in a box in my garage, moved house 5 times and left it there until last year, when there was what I had grandly announced to be Charmian Clift's 100th birthday. So we had a lot of events for the centenary of Charmian Clift. Meanwhile, she had attracted new readership of her own, both internationally for her 2 travel memoirs, Mermaid Singing and Pearl Me a Lotus, and for a new collection of the essays that I'd brought out with the publisher New South under the groovy title Sneaky Little Revolution. So 3 things came together: international recognition, publication of essays here, and the birthday party. And I felt it was the right time to go to her agent, who is the agent for the Johnston Clift estate, and give the agent, Jane Novak, a copy of the typescript together with a long letter from me, essentially the afterword that's in the book, explaining the provenance of these documents. And Jane took it to the publisher who'd published the essays. They immediately wanted it, and here we are.
Was there much discrepancy between the 2 versions that you came across?
Very little. If there had been discrepancy, I might have been in 2 minds about publishing it, because I would not want anyone to publish my unedited, unfinished work, and I would regard that as a rude thing, an imposition to do to any author. But because these 2 versions had been produced about 6 years apart and they were virtually identical, what she'd done rather ridiculously, I think, in the second version, she changed the name of well-known places like the city of Wollongong to Wannerong. She'd sort of blurred a couple of other place names, which didn't add anything, because we all know that it was Wollongong or Kiama. So I changed those back to the original version. But conversely, with the names of certain people, she changed them, and I left them changed in case anybody got hurt, because people can get upset to find themselves in books, though I think that all the people would be well and truly dead by now. There was the normal editorial work that happens after 70 odd years. We have a different style in regard to certain punctuation, but Clift's punctuation was idiosyncratic. It was all her own, and I didn't mess with that. But I might make a change if a word's been hyphenated or something.
So let's get back to the story. It's the story of the Morley family living in a small town on the New South Wales south coast. It's prosaic and poetic at the same time.
It's an enchanting story because it's the story of a young girl growing up. And I think there's a number of really beautiful Australian memoiry, autobiographical novels about children growing up, and particularly about young girls growing up. It's a pastoral, by which I mean it's set in the country and it's imbued with the sense of the country. But it's set in a country town in the years of the Great Depression. That is only slightly, lightly sketched, but we get this sense of economic hardship for all the men of the valley. Now, it's a little valley, it's still there, but it's now been bypassed by the highway, of quarry workers. So on the cover of the book, there's a beautiful painting that shows Bombo Headland striding out, as she said, to sea like a battleship. And in that headland, if you haven't been there, I advise you to go. It's like a moonscape, the most amazing landscape. It's all been blasted into a huge amphitheatre as the granite was taken from the quarry. It was the granite used by the railway commissioners to put between the railway lines. So it was a major quarry, and Charmian's real-life father, Sid Clift, was the engineer at the quarry who kept it going through the Great Depression. So no men of the Little Valley lost their job, so some were on reduced hours and wages. So there were only about 20 houses in the little settlement. Over the hill in Kiama proper, there was a lot more houses that are still there. But in Charmian's little settlement, there were and are about 20 what she called butter boxes, 2 or 3 bedroom houses with the bullnose veranda, which wasn't a bourgeois thing at the time. And people lived in a considerable level of poverty. It was a hard time. They lived on their own vegetables, the rabbits the kids caught, the fish that the father caught. And it's an idealised version of Charmian Clift's childhood and family. My biography is called The Life and Myth of Charmian Clift, and a lot of my job in writing that, which took me 20 odd years, was to unravel this myth that she made. I believe that she was a lonely, isolated, unhappy and bullied little girl. She was the third in her family, and it was well known that she was the afterthought or the mistake. She and the whole family did not fit into the social mores of the little valley where they lived. So they didn't fit into Kiama proper because they lived out in the sticks with the quarry workers, but they didn't really fit in with the quarry workers because they had bookshelves full of Shakespeare and Baudelaire and Rabelais, which meant that the children swore like troopers, and because there was a certain elitism to both of their parents. Mum used to quote Byron as she hung the washing on the line. Dad was given to ranting politically and in terms of literature at his fellow workmates. So the mother was known as Lady Muck. The older sister was known as the Duchess. I don't know Charmian's nickname in the valley, but I bet you she had one, and it wasn't very nice. So just as many lonely children will invent an imaginary friend, Charmian had a sort of imaginary friend, but it was a bit different because it was what we call her alter ego, her other version of herself. So I believe that as Charmian was living her life, she was in parallel making up from about the age of 8 or 9, a parallel life of a happy little girl living a happy little life with lots of companions and friends. And she had different names over time for this fictional version of herself. And fairly early on, it was Tina. That became Christine, Chris, and then that became Cress or Cressida. She stuck with the surname Morley, perhaps meaning that they were grasping for more through a lot of these manifestations. So the mother in The End of the Morning is an idealised version of Charmian's mother. Similarly, the father is an idealised version. But something odd happened with the sister because Charmian had an elder sister called Margaret, whom I met and interviewed and became friends with and used to sit and chat in the kitchen. She was a delightful woman, but she was the big sister, and sibling rivalry happens between same-sex siblings. And so the depiction of Margaret, who's called the Shakespearean name of Cordelia in the book, is a much less pleasant version than I think the real girl was.
We're looking really at the passing of time and the simple daily rituals of this family, and through it, this procession of family portraits in this landscape.
Yes, very much so. And it's good that you referred to this landscape and this place, because I love books that have a very strong sense of place. And I don't think I've ever read any book that has a stronger sense of place than this one. So the place is the driving engine of the people and the plot. When I began work on this, as I said, I had read the typescript and I'd photocopied the typescript in the National Library. Back in about January 1981 or 82, I went down on the long weekend at the end of January and stayed in a motel room right in Charmian Clift country, right in that little settlement, and spent 3 days wandering around, taking photos, making notes, and I could navigate myself completely by the manuscript. And then after doing that, I went back to Sydney, showed the photos to Charmian's sister Margaret, and she confirmed, yes, that's Jacob's Ladder, and yes, that's exactly that. So I knew all the children's nicknames of all the places from the book. And so it's a tiny little valley with a creek running through it. It's also got a railway line running right along the beach. So if we look at it, If we think it's idyllic coastal landscape, yes, it is now. But when Charmian was living there, as Margaret pointed out to me, it was a very noisy, dirty kind of place because the trains that had not coal but gravel were going up and down that railway line, and they were letting off the noise of the steam engine, and dynamite was being used to blast the quarry. I'll just read you the one sentence, first paragraph of the book. In those days, the end of the morning was always marked by the quarry whistle blowing the noon knock-off. And so there was a whistle that told all the men and all the women that it was time for lunch. And similarly, there would be the whistle blown before the dynamite was let off, but the whistle would also be blown if there was a death or a disaster. So you can imagine if it wasn't at 12 o'clock, all the wives would have their hearts in their mouths when they heard that whistle go off at an unfamiliar time. So it is imbued with the sense of a noisy but picturesque landscape.
Charmian had published two travel memoirs prior to this one, Mermaid Singing and Peel Me a Lotus. And although End of the Morning is not strictly a memoir, though it is autobiographical in some sense, is there something that connects these works?
Yes, there is. And when we say memoir or autobiography, we are thinking in terms of a first-person narrative or the I voice. And this is absolutely significant. Going back a little bit before the writing of The End of the Morning, or going back to the early days of Charmian and George, they did very well with their first novel. It won a prize, and they got excited and they signed a 3-book contract to produce 3 collaborative novels. And it was an albatross about Charmian's neck because she was a slow private writer and George was a very fast public writer. So it wasn't until she got to Greece, living on the island of Kalymnos in 1955, that she wrote her first solo book, as she called it. And that was the travel memoir you just mentioned, called Mermaid Singing, an account of the family living on the island of Kalymnos. And it happened almost by accident. She was writing journal passages and descriptions for George to put into the collaborative novel, The Sponge Divers, which came out under both their names. And she suddenly realised that she could sort of put the tapestry of all these little bits and pieces together and get a book. And because it was a journal, it was first person. And in that, she found her voice. She said she went to Kalymnos to hear a mermaid, but what she heard on the island was her own voice singing loud and clear, a very unique first-person voice. It's the voice she subsequently used in the second travel memoir, Peel Me a Lotus. It's the voice she used to such great effect in her essays, so it's why readers of the essays used to feel that she was having a chat over the kitchen table with them, because she addresses the reader directly. And it's that same first-person voice, though she's calling the first person her alter ego, Cressida Morley, that she uses in The End of the Morning. So yes, it is that voice that connects this quasi-novel, autobiographical novella, bit of a novel, with the travel books, but also with the essays, which is why I felt it was not making a rag bag of the book to bung 30-odd essays up the back. It is not an extraneous amount of material, because we have the same voice being used in the essays as we have in The End of the Morning.
Nearly all Australian adults of a certain age will have read My Brother Jack at school, if not elsewhere, but not as many might realise that My Brother Jack was in many ways a collaboration, as you said. Charmian's book, I think you called it. But Cressida Morley actually appears as a character in that book.
Yes, so what happened was, by the winter of 62-63, the couple had been living in Greece for nearly a decade. George had this very bad tuberculosis, but it hadn't been properly diagnosed. He thought he was told he had a little bug called Hoffman, whatever that means. He used to suffer pneumonia very badly every winter. He thought he was going to die, possibly that winter, and he said he'd broken the back of 25 books. He wanted to write one great book before he died. So he started to write this book set in what he really knew, which is his own lower middle class childhood in Melbourne. Charmian had already begun work on The End of the Morning. She'd found the voice of Cressida Morley. She was writing it in the first person. She'd written the first typescript I had, the first 30, 50 odd pages, and she put that aside, and there's many accounts from both of them at this, that in their big kitchen dining room there was a step between the two levels of the room, and she sat on a cushion on that step through the whole of that winter, because they had only enough money to pay for wood to heat that one room. And as George's pages of typescript rolled out of the typewriter, she would take them and read them and give him feedback and suggest, oh, why don't you think about this a little bit more? Why don't you take this a little bit further? So that George, on at least 2 occasions in interviews, said it was virtually a collaboration. And as you've mentioned, he called it Charmian's book. At the end of this book, as his alter ego, who's called David Meredith, who's a war correspondent as he was, comes back to Melbourne on leave towards the end of the war, he meets a beautiful young lieutenant called Cressida Morley, and he describes her as a pagan with sand between her toes, and as having these uniquely beautiful green eyes. It's a description that, frankly, any woman would die for. So we can be absolutely certain that Charmian gave her blessing to her character and her name going into My Brother Jack. Things got a bit hairy and things got a bit different when George decided to write a sequel or 2 sequels, but that's a different story.
My final question to you is really about what this novel could have been. It's an unfinished novel. What could you project, if anything, in this book that The End of the Morning could have been?
I call one of the chapters, it's the chapter that begins part 2, and part 2 is called The Big Adventure. And this is a quote from Clift from an interview that she gave to the National Library in the 1960s. And she's referring to her young womanhood when she went to London and then went to Greece and fell in love with George and began writing as a professional writer. And she says, this was in a way the most wonderful period of my life because I was still very young and I was still young enough to be seeing all this in the terms of a novel and of great drama, myself in character, as it were. And I think that tells us that Clift was going to write this on into the story of her life. Just as a little girl, she always had this fictional Cressida, Christina, whatever you call her. She also saw herself as living out the life of herself as a character. Call her Cressida Morley if you like. And in an interview that she gave in late 1968 to a journalist, she was in the middle of writing the novel, and she referred to it as being a novel about Australia. Now, that's fascinating because you and I have talked about it as a novel about a tiny little microcosm of a quarry settlement on the coast, but she saw it as a novel about the whole continent. So I think she saw the trajectory of a young woman going out into the world, being part of World War II, going out into the further world of London and Greece, and then returning to an Australia that was developing its identity. I think that was the plot of the novel that she was projecting.
Well, Nadia, it's a fascinating story. Thank you for bringing it to us, and thank you for joining me on the Good Reading Podcast.
Thank you for a chance to talk about it.
I've been talking to Nadia Wheatley about Charmian Clift's previously unpublished novel, The End of the Morning. It's published by New South Books, and you can find it at goodreadingmagazine.com.au. My name's Greg Dobbs, and thanks for listening. This Good Reading Podcast was brought to you by Book People Gift Cards. Share the joy of reading with a Book People gift card. To find out more, visit bookpeoplegiftcards.org.au.